Professor Alexander Etkind, and Professor Alexander Etkind will introduce himself in a moment. And as you are used for us, we discuss every week a special topic related to the war. The last couple of weeks we discussed Ukrainian literature, and this week we wanted to change the subject and put Professor Etkind Alexander's work in the spot, so to say, to think about this terrible war that's now going on in Ukraine. So welcome, Alexander. Good to have you here. Could you say a few words on yourself, Alexander? And you are well known, but not everybody will know you, I think so. So who is Alexander Etkind, and well, what are you doing in this world?
Well, first, thank you very much, Ruud, for inviting me. I'm very pleased to hear that you are reading my work, and that's my hope that our listeners now will all start reading my work. That would be fantastic. I'm a historian, and I'm of Russian origin. I was born in St. Petersburg some years ago. And also some years ago, but basically a bigger half of my life I spent in immigration, and I taught at Cambridge University and then at the European University Institute at Florence for long, like for 8 to 10 years in each place. And now I'm speaking from the University of Constance in southern Germany, where I have spent the spring and summer writing another book. Maybe I will tell you about this. My new project in the end. But I'm moving to Central European University at Vienna, and I will start teaching there from September. So I'm teaching, and I'm writing books, and I probably wrote about 10 or a dozen of them in English and in Russian, and some of them have been translated into several languages. I think nothing have been translated into Dutch, which I'm really sorry about that. Yeah. So I'm writing about Russian cultural history, and also about Russian politics to some extent. But my very last book, which I don't know, Ruud, have you seen it or not? It was called Nature's Evil, Cultural History of Natural Resources. So it's very sort of close to history of economic life, to history of natural resources, things like grain, timber, fur, fish, and of course, oil and coal and natural gas, etc. And it's more like global. This is my first sort of try to do things globally. It's not. It's a global history with some focus, on Russia, but not too much of that.
No, and maybe one of these themes, nature's evil. So somehow evil has always been a subtext of your books, if I may say so. So
that's true. That's true. Of course, I was. You probably mostly mean my book Warped Mourning, which is a history of memory and mourning for the victims of Stalinism. So the Great Terror and the Gulag left millions of victims who obviously cannot tell their stories because they were just buried or they were left unburied. There, but also there are other people like survivors of the Gulag, survivors and descendants, sons, daughters, grandchildren, but also, of course, friends and widows and wives, etc., and husbands. So I was looking at these memoirs and also novels and films and also museums that tell the stories of this, ordeal, and how this memory, also monuments, how this memory was kept, or rather was destroyed in the later decades.
So
we talked very much about evil.
Yeah, And we come to that in a minute. But if I may ask you now, if you look at the war in this, is for us it is this 19th week of what we are now working on this program, and we ask our guests every time how you experience the war this week, and it's like a chronicle of the war. And the first week was very much different than the weeks today. How you look at the war this week? So.
Well, like probably many of us here, I'm sort of obsessed with this news from Ukraine, and I look at various canals, including the Belarusian site Nexta, which gives actually interesting information, kind of unusual source of the insider, but also kind of interesting source. And of course, I'm reading mainstream news and I'm using Twitter and Facebook, and there are lots of stuff there. But this week, of course, was kind of tense, but also nothing much changed at the fronts. So the war has stabilized, and it's worrying by itself, because this stability, it could last for very long. We know this how it worked in the previous war in Donbass. So because I see this, I call it the Russo-Ukrainian war. That's my sort of, I don't think it's my invention, but that's my choice, because this is a war which has no name. Putin said it's not war, it's special operation. So actually the word war is banned in Russia. And when they interview me in Russian, so I say Vaina, which means war, but they replace it by this peak, like obscene, like an obscene word, like fuck you. So it goes with all the way. But they're fine with it. But of course we need a name, right? Like, what is it? So Ukrainians prefer the word Russian invasion in Ukraine. But I think that's problematic, because once again it deprives Ukrainians of agency, and that's a problem through and through. That like everything is done by Russians, or say by Americans or Europeans and the globals. But on this level of whatever this discursive politics, we don't really see the actions of Ukrainians themselves. So just the Russian invasion in Ukraine, I don't like it. So my choice is the Russo-Ukrainian war, and it started in 2014, and like in every war it had periods, like the Crimean period and the Donbass period, and now the all-out period. That's sort of my very simple periodization. So during the last week, this all-out period changed into this sort of position war, which looks like the World War I story, with huge numbers of victims, but not much movement of the fronts. And obviously, one of these fronts could collapse in a time, and that would be decisive. And we don't know which one. We can hope which one will collapse. But it's very sort of strenuous and very tense week.
Yeah, I agree with that. So we're actually, if you read all these news sites every week, and especially as my friend was living here, of course, this was our daily breakfast was the war, so to say, what was going on. And okay, there are again a bomb on Lviv or not, so to say. It's rather quiet the last couple of weeks, so to say. But it became a bit like, probably the war in George Orwell's 1984. And there was also a constant war going on in the East, and it was like a frozen front, so to say, and it was part of the power relation. So and I'm very afraid that it could be developed in something like this, but simply it's going on for years, but and becomes part of our culture, so a part of normality. And of course, this is not going on by itself, of course, but that's that's one of the things what I think, and including these huge accounts of human losses. So this is a terrible thing. So in that sense.
Well, in Orwell in 1984, it's a global war. It's like three superpowers that divide the war. They also have this sort of conflict, eternal conflict. And so far, this war could develop into such a thing, but so far, of course, it has not. So to me, it looks more kind of similar to, as I said, to the fronts of World War I, which also shows that this sort of positioned war, static war, could actually last for very long.
Like in North France.
Yeah.
But we terrible enough, right? So
France and also absolutely, and in some periods the Eastern Front, meaning the Russian front, was also not moving, but it was terrible. So major battles, and all this eternal artillery duels, but not much movement, huge numbers of victims.
And how do you this experience, because you are from Russia? So borders and I don't know how long you live in outside Russia. So I don't have a
bigger part of my life.
The bigger part of your life, and so and now you're do you consider yourself as a Russian?
Well, I'm Russian Jew. That's that's always with me. That's my origin, but and I have all kinds of problems connected to that origin. I do consider myself as Russian.
And now you're working as a Russian Jew in Constance in Germany. And could you say a last word of that? So how is this discussion going on in your university city in Constance? This is because Germany has also a special relationship now to the war, you can say so.
Well, frankly, I've been in Constance like for 2 months or 3 months, and I'm mostly enjoying my close colleagues here. There is a very good history department and people who specialize actually in Eastern Europe. Not so much in Ukraine so far, but they want to start. And I'm enjoying the lake, Bodensee. It's a great in the summer. But I spent the spring and the last 9 years of my life in Florence. So I just moved from Florence to Constance 3 months ago. And there in Florence, actually, there are surprisingly many Ukrainians. So there were several demonstrations that I went to and took part in with. So I wrote some posters or painted some posters in Russian, something like Putin убийца, Putin a bloody murderer, things like that. And the Ukrainians were actually very happy to see Russian posters and Russian professor being there. That I also took some of my Dutch or Italian students. They also joined the demonstration. We used to have at the university where I taught, the European University Institute, it's called. We used to have several brilliant Ukrainian students, and they have all defended their doctoral dissertations and left. One of them is now in Lviv. Bogdan Shumilovich is his name, and he's a brilliant scholar. And he's there, under bombing, sporadic bombing that they have. He takes part in some kind of defense activities, teaches history in the university. And I hope that he will be able to come to Europe to have a postdoctoral study, but it's difficult actually for Ukrainian men.
Yeah, for Ukrainian men is now not possible basically, or you have to make it possible, but you should be in your country, so by law. That's basically what it is. So let's change your work. So when we discussed the war here well, one of the things what struck us, and I'm sure we are not the only ones, that there is some sense, it sounds a bit stupid, but senseless, and a sort of that the reasons what are giving to the war, and what circulate in narrative and discourse are a sort of madness, a sort of delirium, in the sense that you say, well, it doesn't make any sense in a usual way if we think about war as an imperialistic war, and a war about the land, or war about resources, war about geopolitical power. Of course, it's there. But in a certain sense, this is a war what still needs a kind of an explanation or an understanding. That's a better word. And then I was thinking about your work, about the Gulag and about internal colonization. And I was thinking that your work on warped mourning could say something about what is actually happening now, that Russia is invading, having a war, as you say so, with Ukrainians, killing what it's considered his brothers, so to say. And the idea is that this had something to do with what you describe of the difficulties in Russia in coming to terms with its own history, especially the Stalinistic history. As my friend used to say, the Russians didn't have do their homework yet. Now, homework is a bit like let's say to a light word, so to say, to mention that. But there is something what's at stake. And I think that in your books, you exactly say, well, there has been done some homework. And a great deal of that, but it was a special homework, and it did leave out a lot of questions which should have been answered if you tried to come to terms with the Stalinist terror and the atrocities and whatever. So, do you think that your book on the Gulag could say something, and the Mourning could say something about this, the background of this war in Ukraine?
Yes, I do think, but it obviously needs sort of revision and expansion for doing this, because first you started by saying very, very correctly. I fully agree that this say natural resources, is whatever the other like coal, or maybe shale. People are now talking much about this Ukrainian shale, but it has nothing to do really with the actual reasons for war. Grain has become a kind of a major issue for the world, but not for Russia. This is not what Russia is doing, that to capture this millions of tons of grain. Russia obviously has way more money right now than it needs or could possibly use. So we need some other explanation. And while most of imperialist wars or colonial wars in the past, they were directed onto a particular natural resource that was known for the colonizer, for the invader. Like Columbus, he believed that there was gold in America, in that land where he was going to. He believed in that, and he's heard some stories. He was driven by this, by the information about gold. In some other cases, it was silver for the Spaniards, or maybe coal for the British, obviously, cotton or silk, etc. So these colonizers, they could be wrong in their ideas, or their maps were wrong, or their geology was fake. But they had this idea, what they wanted to find. While for Mr. Putin, I think it doesn't really work. So it is an imperialist war, because Russia is going to sort of to occupy, annexate, and colonize Ukraine, as it did it with Crimea, which is a part of Ukraine. But it's not a sufficient explanation. Better explanation is to say that it is a revanchist war. It is an imperialism married to revanchism. And this is closer to the truth, because in Putin's mind, I think Ukraine it was a part of the Soviet Union and earlier of the Russian Empire, and it remained to be a part of his mental map of his country. And then it somehow disobeyed, as Chechnya say disobeyed, but Chechnya disobeyed while, or wanted to, to be separate while it was at least legally. And in many ways, and in many other ways, it also was economically was a part of the Russian Federation, but Ukraine was not. But Putin really sort of denies this difference, and it's a deep denial. So it's revanchism in the sense that, okay, so things were right, then they were wronged by some kind of evildoers, so now I will just make them right again. Coming back to the initial condition. Columbus didn't go to the initial condition. He was occupying, unknown land. So that colonial adventures were kind of romantic and exciting because of that, because of the unknown. While, of course, there is nothing similar going on here. It's revanchism way more than, I think, imperialism. But since we are talking about specifically about word mourning, there is an idea in that book that mourning is mimetic. So mourning, when we mourn, we kind of reproduce mentally the loss. So we imagine the loved one who has died, or we imagine the scene when she or he was dying, or maybe he killed, or think about our participation in that, our responsibility, my responsibility. So this mourning is essentially a train of thoughts and feelings about the loss, and sort of reimagining, reenacting the loss and the situation. And this reenactment is really, it's kind of widespread activity, so also in Russia. This reenactment of battles, World War II, now went to World War I, even to Napoleonic Wars, people kind of dress, and etc., etc. So they reenact. There are some reenactments of Gulag as well. In my book, which was not really about this post-Soviet Russia, but about the Soviet period, I show that some of this, mourners, they really went there to the place, to the former camps of Gulag, sort of were trying to find the graves or maybe the cells where their loved ones were kind of imprisoned or died. And they were really obsessed by this sort of, and in some cases, some important writers or rock stars who were sort of who were writing or talking or singing about the Soviet terror, they actually were imprisoned themselves. They did something bizarre but purposeful, so that they got into the Soviet prison themselves. So this reenactment, this mimetic mourning, could go far. And now I'm thinking that this invasion in Ukraine could be also an act of reenactment of that Soviet experience in all its glory and terror together. It's obviously very perverse mourning, but mourning has these different modifications. Some of them are stranger than others. So that title was warped mourning. But if I was writing now about the Ukrainian and Russian war, I would say that it was a perverted mourning.
You said some. I think it's a very rich book, Warped Mourning, and well, for me, it's also a kind of a bridge of understanding Russia and Russians, and authors I'd never heard about before, to be honest, so to say. But so one of the things what seems to me is so immensely complicated. You make some comparison between the Vergangenheitsbewältigung when it comes to the Nazi past and the way to deal with the communist past. And one of the things is what you wrote, I think, is that well, if you look at the Nazi war, the Nazi atrocities, it was something done to an ethnic other, so to say, and then you have basically to come to terms when your fathers or mothers or your brothers or sisters has committed such atrocities to others who are not your ethnic, so to say, not your ethnic alliance or whatever, how you say that. What makes it so different in Russia, and what you also say, is that this is not the murder of something other, but a sort of suicide. So in a sense, I think you said it so literally. And this, for me, this, and also this change of roles. So you have the victims or the perpetrators, who are the victims of tomorrow and so on. This dynamics, it's so very different. And for me, I think that is a huge question to come to terms with that, and to so, and you also say some things about it that you say, well, it's not really a success story, so to say, to come to terms with this war, come to terms, maybe the wrong word, and then you say, well, then it's not remembered, but it keeps repeating itself. So, and it keeps repeating itself, and it becomes coming back and back again in an uncanny way, unheimlich, to speak with Freud, so to say. And that's, I find very fascinating, that there is something coming back and not being processed in the own history and our own personal history, what is, of course, a combination of really tragic experiences, so to say, and this is coming back in a sense of an uncanny. And can this war be this uncanny?
So this is not remembered, but it is reenacted, and there is some deep paradox here, and also some horror coming immediately from this combination. Indeed, as you said, in the Stalin's terror, in this prisons, people, there were cases when, say the great poet Mandelstam, he was investigated by a guy, by a particular officer. And then this officer was imprisoned like 3 months after that. He also got into jail, and Mandelstam learned about that. So some inmates, his fellow inmates, in the Gulag way, like from one person to another, they passed this information. Mandelstam learned about that he's the guy who kind of investigated and possibly beated him. We don't know exactly. Was also imprisoned, and actually he committed suicide in the camp. Mandelstam died, and in horrible conditions, and that guy just committed suicide. And also it's a kind of interesting story, kind of motif of the novels about this period, that a survivor of the Gulag meets his investigator, maybe meet the commandant of the camp in the later life, and in one novel they go to a restaurant together and they become actually friends and drink a lot together, because that's kind of interesting idea of kind of reconciliation around the vodka and common experience to a sense. But of course, in the Holocaust and in the Nazi Germany, that was indeed different, because the Jews that were killed were distanced as much as possible. They were embodiment of evil in all ways, but in fact they spoke the same language, they spoke German, they did the same things, they lived in the same city, they dressed the same way, and they read the same books or wrote the same books. And, it took a lot of effort just to identify a Jew. So they had to look at circumcision, for instance, if it was a man, or to some archival data, because there was no other way to identify who was. Do you know the story of Shibboleth? It is in the Bible, in the book of Judges, that a particular ancient Jewish tyrant, he basically he defeated the enemy, and then he asked these defeated people to say a Jewish word Shibboleth, and those who said Sibboleth, they were died. Many thousands died, were killed. So this circumcision is like Shibboleth. But also the difference between Russians and Ukrainians is very similar. If there is any difference, but you cannot see it, by whatever, by facial or racial features, or by the clothing or whatever. You cannot hear it in many cases. They speak exactly the same Russian language. And the Shibboleth test would not identify Ukrainian nowadays. So I'm actually working on this concept of genocide of minor differences, because most cases of genocide, the Armenian genocide by the Turks or the Holocaust, it was actually committed by one people against another people, but not in the situation when these two people were really different racially or historically. They belong to some different ends of history. One was much more advanced, or economically, etc. People exploited, say the whites exploited the blacks, say the black slaves, made use of them brutally. But that was not genocide. So genocide happened actually between the neighbors who were very similar to each other, like the Germans and the Jews, say in Berlin at the start of the Holocaust. And the same happens to Ukrainians nowadays. So Sigmund Freud wrote an essay called Narcissism of Minor Differences. And he speculated about this particular kind of hatred that similar people feel towards each other. And he brought some examples from the Balkans, for instance, which actually were the future prospective sides of genocide. So that's an interesting area to look at.
Yeah, and well, when a friend of mine is a journalist working in Ukraine, and he spoke to some colleagues who were basically worked in the Chechenian war and in the Syrian war, and they said, well, the violence of this war in Ukraine is uncomparable with the violence in Syria and in Chechnya and on other places. So that's something which really gives me to think about. This is this ruthlessness with this war is executed, especially when you come to see it as a war against what you see as your minor brothers, as Russians like to say that, so to say. And this dehumanizing aspect of the war, what you could say. So all Ukrainians are Nazis, Ukraine shouldn't exist, shouldn't be on the map, and Ukrainians should be wiped out if possible. It's a genocidal program, if you say, so if you phrase it that way. Could that be related with this warped memory, so to say? So because what is especially struck with the idea of warped memory is that in this descriptions which you gave, they are very rich, so in the sense that in books and films and so on, there is some missing what I would say ethical perspective. In a sense, you could say there is no revenge, there is no retaliation, there is no one who had to answer for it. Is also the language used by Khrushchev. And so, in the sense, what kind of atrocities, how to label them, so to say, and what is left out is basically what you see in the German version of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. So after Mitscherlich, so to say, but then this is especially a moral program, what developed over generations, and that's what I think is why I'm missing in this is in the way the generations, the first and second and the third generations are dealing with that. And one of my hypotheses is that it's so difficult because, well, you are saying something about someone who is going to be your brother or your aunt or your mother or your father. Even you describe experiences in the Gulag where you say, well, the Gulag is horrible, but the communist regime was not so bad, so to say, and that kind of thing. So this leaving out of this moral perspective, is this something that you also see in this warped mourning?
Yeah, this is probably true. I mean, comparing it to the German history or to the Japanese history or after World War II, it's definitely true because, you know, these nations became so peaceful, so moralizing, so moral, but also so pacifist and moralizing. You know, they emphasize that sort of high standards. But of course, and Russians, it's very much different, as different as they could be. But the actual history was very different. Both Germany and Japan were occupied by the enemy, and this enemy, the Americans and some Europeans, they sort of supported a long-term historical schooling for these nations, and that's a great thing that the schooling did work, because one could easily imagine that it would not, but in that particular situation it did work. That's great. But without an occupation, it's difficult to imagine what would have happened, say, to Germans if they were sort of left as they were. Obviously, say, camps would be bombed and banned, or whatever. There would be no camps anymore, but nothing instead. What would have happened? I mean, history would be entirely different, pretty difficult, I think. But this is more or less what happened to Russians.
Because
even worse so, because all the institutions were not cancelled. I mean, in the picture that I kind of tried to show, that all the institutions would be cancelled. But in the post-Stalinist Russia, Stalin died, Khrushchev produced his revelations, but all the institutions kept working. They were reformed to some extent. They kept these reforms, until basically until now, until the start of the war. But they were there. So this situation is very, very difficult. Like how to change oneself from within.
Yeah,
it's a different story.
Yeah, it's also what you wrote in your book. So learning about yourself is the most difficult thing to do, what you somewhat right. And I think that's totally true. So,
but maybe changing oneself is even more difficult.
It's even more difficult, yes. I can say that from my own experience. It's not an easy thing to do. And okay. Yeah, and so, but on the other hand, you also write something that is this when you have let's say a productive mourning, so to say, not that someone is repeating himself, but is remembered. I think it's an intergenerational thing. It keeps coming back. Like in the Netherlands, we also look back at World War II. Every generation has its new story, so to say, and it is also a productive story. It adds new elements what weren't there a generation ago. And I think then you said something also related to Jewish memory, for instance, that you say that it's a potential resource for developing a kind of cosmopolitan view of the world, humanity, and so on. So in that sense, you could say that this not being able to mourn in this proper way is not only something that is let's say that doesn't only that atrocities can repeat again, but then in a different way, in an uncanny way. But it also leaves out the possibility, so to say, to use the experience as something to make a step forward, like say in this way as you described it. So it never comes to the moment that you say this. There is a moral, and not a moralizing, but a moral justice possible, and that's so tragic, I think. So when you look at the history, that it's not possible to do that.
Yes, it is absolutely tragic. Yeah, but for a while, I believe that, and many people believe that, despite all these difficulties, Russia, this kind of domestic violence, internal violence was decreased hugely, and this new generations of leaders, like from Khrushchev to Putin, they were sort of increasingly less violent. There were at least political violence became a rare thing. But then, of course, this major sparks, like fires, like in Chechnya and in Georgia, then in Chechnya, of course, was a big manifestation of internal violence. But then it somehow was redirected onto this former properties, former belongings, former this kind of revanchist ways. This internal violence was redirected onto places like Georgia, now Ukraine. And that's an interesting process, which really is sort of, I'm trying to describe right now, but we don't really have concepts or words to talk about that.
Yeah. In a certain sense, now there's a new chapter written to your book, Mourning, because you, as you say, you basically try to cover the Soviet period, and now we are in an episode of history where NGOs, institutions like Memorial are banned in Russia, so to say. Well, how do you explain that?
Well, I think it's it actually fits this idea, this model of reenactment, sort of like reenacting again instead of remembering. Because the Memorial, obviously, was a public organization which had the task of keeping memory and also organizing events of mourning, events and ways of public mourning for the victims of Stalinism. So they kept archives and they built monuments and they created annual events, but also they were concerned about human rights now, and that was like another part of the activity, just to watch human rights, violation of human rights now. And one could of course explain why they've been closed or they're unused. That people have been arrested. Just yesterday, someone in the Urals was arrested, a leader of the local memorials organization in Yekaterinburg. It's easy to explain it on individual cases because, of course, if they watch human rights and then there's law enforcing organizations that violate human rights daily, of course, they don't like it and they fight with that. But on a kind of larger level, I see here some sort of reenactment, like terror happening again. So this sort of remembering activity was not sufficient to prevent it from being reenacted.
Yeah, and it's you can also see this in the changing narrative on the Great Patriotic War. It was in the beginning, it was like remembering the victims, so to say, and then it became remembering the victors, and then we became remembering Russia as the victor. Right? That's the guy who was victorious in this. And what somehow keep puzzling me, because you could have all kind of explanations for this. You could say, well, it is the KGB who wants to keep the power, and in a certain sense, it's all true, so to say. You can say, well, as you refer to, the most prominent institution in Russia what survived was the KGB, and it's now KGB on power, so to say. And so in that sense, it's very real. It's nothing symbolic about it, so to say. And so, and on the other hand, this symbolic, also this language of empire, which in a certain sense, if I would say in the Netherlands, well, look at me, I'm Napoleon and I'm fighting for the French Empire, I would be locked up in a lunacy. That's so to say. You say, okay, you are not, so, but if you're the president of the Russian Federation, you can say, well, I'm Peter the Great, and we are now in gaining back our land, what always have been ours, so to say. And that there is something in it, what I think, well, this is not sane, right? That's what you say. And that is also why what keeps repeating in making a memorial illegal, prohibiting all kind of memory experiences and so on. It's like what you could say. It's like a massive verdrängung, I would say, and so of a very painful experience in Russian history. But by this verdrängung, it won't go away. This is the problem, and the point is that it seems that it keeps repeating itself every time in a more violent way. So, and that's really a worrying thing, because in that, if you think about the Ukrainian war, the war in Ukraine, Russia-Ukrainian war, you say, well, okay, but how to think about the future of this war? So if you think about things like stopping violence, peace, or whatever, then you are coming on a very difficult and different program what should be executed. Otherwise, it will repeat again. So this is a bit like what I learned from your book, so to say.
Yeah, that's great that you did it.
But I want a therapy, you know.
Well, the KGB, frankly, in the Soviet Union, it was an important organization, but there were forces over KGB. You know, the party was in full control of KGB. The army, the military were like a counter force. So the Soviet Union, you know, horrible as it was in my mind, still had this sort of dispersed power structure. There were, you know, counterbalances to, you know, and making some kind of individual decision was very difficult if it ever happened. You know, like when Brezhnev ordered, you know, invasion to Afghanistan, you know, they discussed it, you know, for weeks and for months, you know, on several levels, and we have records of that, and the people were involved, and, you know, they asked experts, and they asked the military, of course, was, you know, decisive. While, of course, this war is entirely different, couldn't be more different from this, you know, Brezhnevite picture. So this is KGB on steroids, really. The KGB is really sort of does what it wants, what does Mr. Putin wants, without, you know, consulting anything or anybody. No other body has any importance. And you know, in such situation, of course, you know, this leader would go insane. That always happened. And he goes insane, and then, you know, other people suffer in millions.
So maybe we can switch a bit, like the concept of internal colonization, which the other book, one I find quite fascinating as a background story of what's happening now in the world. Maybe you can explain again a bit what you mean, because it was in your book when you came up with internal colonization, it was also a critique of current concepts and working with the concept of colonization. And then you introduced or reintroduced the concept of internal colonization, what's especially characteristic for the history of Russia. That's
well, colonization, from your Dutch experience, you know,
we know a lot about
this. Yeah, you had a lot of it, and in a very typical way. So here is a country, you know, in a particular corner of Europe, and then ships and the navy and then commercial fleet the marines go very far, you know, across the oceans, several oceans, in fact, to occupy some, you know, very distant lands, which were entirely different in everything, you know. But there was something valuable that the Dutch knew. It could be whatever, spices or metals, etc. So they went there, either they found it or they didn't find, but the land was already theirs. They found something different, and there was a population that had to be sort of subordinated and disciplined and exploited. And then there were this whatever Suriname restaurants opening in Amsterdam, so there was the opposite flow of culture and some interesting hybrids and mixtures. Now the Russian Empire was largely terrestrial. There were also some places like Alaska that were colonized across the sea, but it was not typical. The typical was this huge expanse, the biggest country in the world. And it was like as Russia is now, underpopulated. The density population was very low, so there were these big expanses of land where different peoples and nations and tribes used to live. And they also did something very different from what Russians wanted them to do. But legally speaking, that was one country within legal borders of the Russian Empire. And when the rulers of St. Petersburg sent their troops, terrestrial troops usually, so say the Cossacks on their horses or the infantry, which went by foot to, say, Siberia. So that was this is what I call internal colonization. So it is colonial activities within the internationally recognized, within the legal territory of the state.
Yep. And then you also described it that it has a different dynamic. You used the word boomerang effect with Hannah Arendt. So and you said, well, it had this boomerang effect. Maybe you should explain this a bit also, but it is about how the experience in the colonies are basically brought back to the motherland, so to say. And in Russia, that was in a different way than in, let's say, my country, or in England, or in France, or so that the experiments in the colonies were basically used. You also talked about Foucault in that sense, were basically used as policies in the heartland, so to say. In
the heartland, exactly, yeah. And that's Hannah Arendt called it boomerang effect, and I borrowed this concept. But in fact, when Arendt wrote about that, so she was talking about the British experience, and she actually meant certain political actors, like certain leaders who used to be viceroys or general governors in India, and then they learned the sort of colonial ways of shutting up the crowd, or dispersing the mob, or suppressing the mutiny, things like that in India. And then they returned to England and became ministers or party leaders, etc. And she meant particular names. And they brought this colonial violence back home. So with this process, the domestic violence increased and turned into an actual political violence that was modeled on the colonial events. So I'm saying it because it's obviously happened both in the external colonization, like in Arendt's case, but in internal colonization, it happened through and through, because there was a lot of mobility. The general governor of Tashkent became the commander-in-chief of the Russian army that suppressed the Polish rebellion, and then this guy returned to Petersburg to be a minister of internal affairs, things like that. And on every move, his sort of skills and habits of violence were just increasing and increasing, and sort of he was teaching his entourage how to do it in a proper way. Yeah. And that's a situation very well described also in Russian literature, and everyone saw it. Internet and culture.
And how was these? Because I think you also said something about the Gulag as one of these forms of internal colonization. So, and I think you even said something, but I'm not sure if I correct you, or if this is right, that you say, well, it's basically the core of this because of the violence what's involved in this in that sense. Is that also true, that this basically is the core of the violence of this internal colonization. Is that how you want to say that? And
the Gulag was definitely, the camps of the Gulag were very, very often instruments.
Yeah.
And the only instruments that this Moscow ministers or commissars and ministers had in their disposal, because they wanted, say, diamonds in Yakutia, very distant lands, or gold in Magadan, or oil somewhere else, etc. And so they built the gulags. Sometimes they did it randomly, but almost always they thought that there was something there that they wanted to exploit in the Slavki, etc., Slavetsky island. But of course, in order to deliver goods over there and to bring this coal from there, from Karaganda in Kazakhstan, so they needed to build railways and other transportation routes, and the camps were commissioned to do that. So there was no labor there. Maybe there were diamonds, maybe there were not. But if there were diamonds, still there was no labor. Then when in the post-Gulag time, when in the 60s, geologists found oil in West Siberia, that was the same problem, but there was no Gulag, so they really didn't know how to resolve it. There was oil, it had huge value if to deliver it. But who would do it over there? In West Siberia, there were marshes and also endemic peoples with their reindeers. It was impossible to use them, even to enslave them, but they wouldn't do it anyway. So but there was no Gulag, so they could not do it by force. So they created specific financial regimes. They paid lots of money, which was forbidden by all Soviet rules. To overpay, it was impossible. But they changed the rules in order to send people, say, from Baku, the oilmen from Baku, and from West Ukraine. And actually, I did with my co-author, that guy whom I mentioned recently, Bogdan Shmilovich, who actually interviewed dozens of old oilmen in West Ukraine who had that Siberian experience. So in the 70s and the 80s, they were going back and forth in a kind of shuttle way for shifts, like 2 weeks in West Siberia, 2 weeks in West Ukraine, and with their families, and then back to West Siberia to drill oil, but also to lay roads, etc. And that was very complex and actually very expensive. So if there was a Gulag, then they would just put tents there and force these people to drill and build roads, etc.
Yeah. So do you consider also, or Ukraine also, as let's say, a subject of this internal colonization, or?
Well, it was internal colony in some sense when it was a part of the Soviet Union, or when it was a part of the Russian Empire. That is, you can call it dialectic, you can call it moving borders, but the state, the empires, particularly the empires, they move their borders, and while a border moves, then this boundary between internal colonization and external colonization also moves. What was external becomes internal. But it's kind of scholastic difference. What is important is that both processes are still colonization, and there is not much difference between them.
Because you also speak about this process of colonization as violence against peasants, as making the difference between the peasant, the burden of the unshaved, so to say, of the shaved.
Shaved man's burden.
Shaved man's burden, exactly. That's what it is, and that makes me. It is all about this difference between who is a worthwhile human being and who is something you can deal with if you like. So, and then you immediately like to think about the Holodomor and so on. So what's going on? So that's it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So for me, these two concepts are. So the warp mourning, and this internal colonization is a kind of way of looking at the war now going on to make some sense of some aspects about it. So are you reading these books now in a different way than when you wrote them 10 years ago almost? You say, see, I said so, or?
No, I mean both. I feel that yes, I said so. In many ways I did, but also I know that I didn't say so because I didn't expect this all-out war. I didn't think that they had, they in the Kremlin had, God's energy, stamina, whatever, libido to do it, really, because it's so kind of self-damaging, self-destroying to do it. We still don't understand why they did it. So I didn't know. I didn't know that. So I can say it true that I did say so.
But maybe you could read your books and say, well, now I'm looking at Ukraine, I'm looking at what's happening now, and I said, well, in the hindsight, I can see now that some things that I think I discovered, I described in these two books, are now acting out in Ukraine in that sense. So
yes, exactly something like that. No, I think that my books are perfectly valid as they were, and I'm not going to revise them, but they need new chapters. And but right now I'm working on a new book called Agony, Russia Against Modernity. And that's the book. That's the book about the current events and it's the immediate causes. And I hope that this book will sort of work as this kind of addition to my previous ones.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you that. Where are you now working on? Because you mentioned it in the beginning, but you're already Russia Against Modernity. Could you say something about already on this? What
I can say a lot, of course, because I'm
do you want to? It's
in the middle of it. But of course, this is agony. Also, the title is Agony. But what is agony, we know, but what is modernity is more difficult to say, to define it. So I'm trying to sort it out, and I'm talking about two kinds of modernity. This is what I basically say in the, what I have written already. There was paleo-modernity of the Soviet type, but also of the Nazi type, and of the New York type. Much of steel and oil and concrete. And the modernity of Anthropocene, which I say, let's call it anthro-modernity, like human modernity, but anthro-modernity from Anthropocene. So Russia is still in this first modernity, paleo-modernity, and it's kind of fighting for stopping the transformation, fighting against anthro-modernity. And another funny word that I coined is stop modernism. As opposed to postmodernism, I say Russia is now engaged in stop modernism.
Yeah. What's basically quite ironic if you look back at the Bolshevik project, what's basically sees itself as the epitome of modernization, so to say. So it is the last stage of not the last, but there should be a state as a communist state, but really is playing out what's already in modernity in terms of industrialization of and of class society and the Soviet or the social project as like the Aufhebung of the class society, and then becoming a modern industrial nation. So in the sense, and I quite agree with you. That one of these remarkable things of the 20th century, that this fascism and Nazism and even the Stalinism are basically anti-modernist strategy. They don't modernize the economy. For instance, you described that also in your book on internal cosmopolitan or eternal colonialism. You say this resource-based economy for now oil, of course, is a kind of it's a kind of economy, but has its own dynamic in the sense of that you have to control the roads of trade, you have to control and so on, and it's not a modernity of labor, of exchange, of trade, and so on. So,
that's all true. But of course, modernity, high modernity, as some people say, call it. It needed, and I now call it paleo-modernity. It needed lots of oil, more and more oil. Ever more metals, ever more energy. ever more people, ever more food for these people. So it was expansion, and of course now we have reached a limit. But we're still modern. I believe we're still modern, and we should just be modern in a very different way. And that's my point. That's an entirely different modernity, and it's a radical transformation. But those who fully depend on that paleo-modernity, on this high modernity of, of say oil production and consumption, they resist, and they resist, in all possible ways. They resist it diplomatically. They resist it by leaks and hacks. Now they resist by open violence.
Yep, and then exactly, and then you can say that, again, coming back to the war in Ukraine, that this is also this uncanny way of resisting to become modern, but then in a moral sense, that you say, well, there are the time of war is over. It's over, that there is any justification of war, except maybe of defending yourself. So.
Well, exactly. But the Ukrainians want to be modern in all possible ways, in a new way.
Yeah,
of course. All the reasons and capabilities of being.
I'm not talking about Ukrainians. I know them too well in the sense what their project is, but more in the way of Putin and his Russia Federation is now playing out the war.
That's agony.
Agony. Yeah. Thank you. Good. We are already talking for more than an hour. I'm very much looking forward to your new book. When it's going to be published?
It should be actually, short and quick book. So I'm writing it for, in a few months it will be out.
Okay. No. Well, we see each other then again.
Okay.
We could talk about your new book. I want to thank you very much for being here with us, and I hope to see you again, definitely.
Same here.
Again, thank you very much for talking with us and sharing your thoughts about the war with Russia and Ukraine, as you say, though. Yeah.
Okay, good luck with your program.
Thank you very much. And you also with your book.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Heel klein gelijk.
Ja, je kan ze natuurlijk niet storen.
Nee, maar ik dacht dat het nog een uur duurde.